Hello, dear friends. My name is Vasyl Pekhno. I'm a Ukrainian journalist, and right now I invite all of you to watch this latest update on Ukrainian battle map situation as of August the 15th. So don't forget to push like buttons, which are situated just under this video, just below it. Leave your comments as well there below the video in the chat, and subscribe to our YouTube channel, because all these activities, they help to provide the best video content to all of you, dear English-speaking auditory. I will start without any doubts right now to let you know what is going on Ukrainian battlefields. Let's begin. Of course, we'll begin with the Dobropillia area, where the Russians had a local breakthrough. Why do I say had? Because right now, this situation with Zaporizhzhia, although it isn't yet reflected on the deep state map as any active changes, has actually started to stabilize somewhat. It really has started to improve a bit. The brigade, sorry, not a brigade, but the National Guard of Ukraine's Azov Corps, which consists of several National Guard brigades and was deployed here to extinguish this fire, to put it out with adjacent and subordinate units, is inflicting very serious losses on the enemy. Even just the night before last, Azov actually released a statement saying that in 2 days of fighting in the Dobropillia area, the Azov Corps managed to eliminate in total 150 occupiers in this breakthrough direction. Just think about those numbers for a moment. Those are, well, just fantastic, truly phenomenal losses. 150 occupiers, actually 151, were eliminated, meaning killed in action. More than 70 invaders were wounded, over 70, and another 8 were taken prisoner. These are the numbers, the statistics for just 2 days of work. I haven't seen such statistics for yesterday yet, but honestly, at this point, we can really talk about this. This is also confirmed by the General Staff. The spokesperson for the General Staff, Andriy Kovalov, said that the situation near Dobropillia is beginning to stabilize, and this can be confirmed based on his understanding, perceptions, and sources. At the moment, regarding what is happening here on the Dobropillia axis, these flanks, where in fact the Russians were supposed to expand, have been reinforced, and this expansion is not happening now. However, the threat of a renewed expansion still remains if the Russians continue to reinforce this area with additional resources. But overall, the current situation is relatively returning to a more controlled and manageable state. Of course, this is certainly not a normal or typical situation, especially if it is indeed as we observed at the very beginning of this particular week. Because, excuse me, but if Azov says that in 2 days they eliminated 151 occupiers, then it's not normal that the official reports from spokespersons mentioned that, well, only 5, at most 10 people broke through. So it turns out the question arises, who is deceiving us? The official spokespersons or the Azov Corps? I think the answer here is actually obvious. The choice is clear when it comes to understanding who is not telling the truth. And in fact, this is a communication issue that really needs to change in the Ukrainian army, because society needs to be spoken to honestly. Society needs to be addressed in a mature way. You can't just mess with Ukrainians' heads and say that everything is fine, everything is normal. No, it's an unrealistic picture to keep feeding us these constant hopes. Because in fact, Ukraine will be at war with the Russian Federation for exactly as long as the Russian Federation exists in its current form. And if it's still fueled by imperial ambitions, then it will last even a bit longer than what I just said. Because this fact needs to be accepted. This fact needs to be accepted because Russia will always pose an existential threat to us. Right now, obviously, this active phase of the war may end or be suspended by some kind of pause, but in the future, we will still have to witness this tragedy. And by the way, another sign that the situation is stabilizing now in the Dobropillia area is the reaction of the Russians. The Russians are not claiming any success. They are silent. I mean, their Telegram channels and other media communities, they are silent. And what does this kind of silence mean? Well, in a normal environment, this could be a matter of maintaining information silence. But we understand that for the Russians, this is an uncontrollable process. They don't have any information blackouts. These are Russians we're talking about. And so they would definitely be shouting if there had been a serious breakthrough. So the second option is at play here. If it's not information silence, then most likely it's the absence of any significant successes in that direction. Otherwise, they definitely wouldn't be keeping quiet. Their propaganda would be shouting about it, especially right before the negotiations in Alaska. So in reality, we can now cautiously point to some signs of this. Nevertheless, the Donetsk Regional Military Administration has still announced the evacuation of several settlements in this area, which are obviously dangerous in this context. These settlements, which are of significant importance, include Andriivka, specifically within the broader Andriivka community, as well as Varvarivka, Rohanska, and Novo Andriivka. These particular settlements are currently subject to a mandatory evacuation order. This directive especially concerns families with young children residing in the area immediately surrounding Druzhkivka, where the situation is particularly sensitive. This is already referring to the Druzhkivka agglomeration. There are some serious obstacles here regarding Druzhkivka. If we are not currently talking about the enemy advancing in this direction from the area of Vasyl, then at the very least we can talk about the movement and threat of the enemy from the area of Poltavka, which is now occupied by the enemy. And without a doubt, the enemy will try to fire on all the roads and all the connections that exist here. That is why the Donetsk Regional Military Administration has declared the evacuation of families with children mandatory, including from Druzhkivka, by the way, because frankly speaking, the situation in Donbass is deteriorating. At the same time, we shouldn't focus solely on Dobropillia. We also need to keep an eye on the situation in Pokrovsk. After all, I have repeatedly mentioned recently that attention should be paid to Bilitske, Rodinske, and Krasny Lyman, where fighting continues in the north. And to the south of Pokrovsk, there are also certain threats. In particular, when we talk about the south, according to our military sources, the enemy has already entered the settlement of Leontovichi. This is actually here near Peshetravnya, and they are fighting for the Troyanda district in the city of Pokrovsk. The enemy is pressing hard here, and there are intense battles going on. But what's most interesting is that in Pokrovsk, if there are any enemy forces, they are very few isolated cases, let's say just a handful of occupiers who are hiding somewhere. Overall, there is no active assault in the city. But it should be acknowledged that some isolated enemy groups are indeed encountered there. A very interesting video was published yesterday by Western media. I hope that these videos were published with full responsibility towards those elderly people, both the grandfather and grandmother whom you will now see in this video. So the grandfather and grandmother pointed out to our FPV drone where the occupier was hiding. It seems that the Telegraph or the Times published this. You see, the grandfather is showing that he's over there in the neighboring house. Fly their drone. He understands that this is our Ukrainian drone, which is searching for the occupier who is hiding, and the grandfather is pointing for it to fly there. Moreover, now the grandmother is coming up as well. She even opens the gate and allows our drone to fly in freely so it can strike the occupier. Again, I want to say I understand and I hope that given all the social responsibility, these two, the grandfather and the grandmother, have already been evacuated, and that further Russian infiltration no longer poses a threat to them because, well, we understand that if they give up the occupiers, there will be questions for them later. But just imagine the level of courage, responsibility, and sheer coolness of those people who remain in our occupied territories or in frontline areas. Because, it really hurts me, honestly. It hurts a lot that right now there are discussions about the temporarily occupied territories, and people talk about them as if they are objects of some kind of agreements. Give this away, get that in return, buy and sell. This kind of bartering when it comes to territories. There are people there are our Ukrainian people, and there are many of them. It is they who help us strike the temporarily occupied territories, hitting various depots, different facilities, and places where the occupiers are concentrated. It was they who made it possible that yesterday in Yenakiv, by the way, that's also in the Donetsk direction. Here you can see these photos from Yenakiv. Reportedly, ammunition depots are burning. Quite large depots were hit by our missile forces or our drones in the frontline area of Yenakiv. And all of this would be impossible without our resistance movement, because our resistance movement is made up of grandpas and grandmas like these. These are the people who help destroy the enemy. Our people are obviously present on the territory of the Russian Federation. After all, recently there have been very active strikes on various targets within Russia. And clearly there are also many people who hate the Putin regime and help our long-range operators carry out these strikes. Because this image, this infographic, very clearly illustrates the recent episodes involving Russian oil refineries on the territory of the Russian Federation over the past few weeks. In fact, over the last 12 days, Ukrainian drones have almost stopped. Well, I say almost because in some cases it's halfway, in others it's a complete halt. The operation of 5 Russian oil refineries in the southern district of the Russian Federation, that is, in the south of Russia, in the Ryazan and Saratov regions, Volgograd, Krasnodar Krai, and Rostov Oblast. So the Ryazan oil refinery on the 2nd of August. On that same day, August 2nd, the Novokuybishevsk oil refinery. Together, they account for about 7% of the Russian Federation's total annual production. Then on the 7th, the Afipsky oil refinery, and on the 10th, the Saratov refinery, which together also make up about another 5%. So in total, that's 12, and 5.5% for the Volgograd refinery, which was hit yesterday on the 14th of August. Well, the night from the day before yesterday to yesterday in Volgograd. This is one of the largest, in fact, the largest refinery in the southern district, processing nearly 15 million tons of oil per year.
Every voice matters. Join our community, support independent journalism and help us bring you the truth from Ukraine. Become a member of Ukraine Today. Join us now.
So in total, we can say that over the past 12 days, give or take, our drones have hit almost 20% of Russian oil refining capacity, and they have made a very significant contribution. And without people who sympathize, without people who help, none of this would be possible, including in the front line and occupied territories. So, friends, compatriots, thank you very much. You have my respect and admiration for your courage. Truly, it is our resistance movement that has contributed to the fact that the offensive in Zaporizhzhia region has still not taken place during the summer campaign. In fact, we have already endured 2 unsuccessful waves of attempted offensives by the enemy. The third wave is currently underway, and Petro Andriushchenko, head of the Center for the Study of Occupation, reports that equipment is now being redirected to the Zaporizhzhia front. In particular, just yesterday, he published information that, although there has been a certain slowdown in the number and intensity of equipment movements from the south, from the Priazovia region, new convoys, 15 trailers carrying armored vehicles such as APCs and IFVs were spotted by our residents in occupied Mariupol. This clearly indicates that this equipment is being transported from Rostov to Mariupol by trailer and then onto the Zaporizhzhia front. And all of this leads to the conclusion that we should expect certain offensive action, specifically in the Zaporizhzhia direction. The Russians are already carrying out preparatory actions for such offensives. In particular, they are probing for weaknesses in our defenses, including around Malatokmachka. Just yesterday, an attack was launched from the Verbove area, which our soldiers repelled in the south. Here's what this attack looked like. It was detected at a distance on the far approaches, and accordingly, these columns and the attempts of the Russian occupiers to advance were neutralized. So in fact, what is very likely now is that on the southern front, our troops will have to create these kinds of kill zones in order to destroy the enemy, to pin them down. By the way, our assault units are operating here. Yesterday, I mentioned that they are present in the Sumy region. I have to admit that, in fact, not only in the Sumy region, but also on the Zaporizhzhia front, we have corresponding assault units and assault detachments operating. This is in particular, for example, the 210th Assault Regiment, good close friends of mine, formerly the Berlin Battalion, and now it's the 210th Assault Regiment. They, in particular, over the past week, have essentially cleared out Stepnohirsk, completely secured all those southern outskirts of Stepnohirsk, where the enemy used to infiltrate. We'll return to the map now, and I'll repeat and show exactly where Stepnohirsk is. And these are actually the scenes of repelling enemy assaults in the kill zones created near Malatokmachka, in the direction of Malatokmachka, which the attack never even reached. It was neutralized by our troops right in this direction. So what does this mean for the enemy now? The enemy is now testing the coherence and resilience of our defense, trying to identify points where they can launch more active attacks. And in Stepnohirsk, which is right here, this blue zone on the southern outskirts of Stepnohirsk has just recently appeared on the deep state map, where the 210th Assault Regiment, together with adjacent units, cleared the southern outskirts of Stepnohirsk. Well, let's return, however, to Donbass and to Pokrovsk, because here near Pokrovsk, we need to keep a close eye on its southern outskirts, as the enemy is also exerting pressure here. As I mentioned, up to Pershotravnev and Leontovichiv, there is enemy infiltration, and they are putting intense pressure in Udakhne. And the same situation is observed with the wide gray zone in Chunishine, where the situation can hardly be called stable, absolutely stable. No, it is not entirely stable. The front line here runs more or less right up to this settlement. The situation in the Lyman direction is also quite difficult and worth monitoring, because according to some reports, so far unconfirmed, the enemy, well, is actually putting more pressure on Andrivka, but some sources, particularly Russian ones, are trying to claim that the enemy is already in Shandriholov. I think the gray zone definitely extends up to this settlement, but as for enemy control of this section of the front by the enemy, well, it's certainly too early to say that for sure. Regarding the Kupiansk direction, just yesterday I had a conversation with the commander of the 429th Achilles Unmanned Systems Regiment, actually with Achilles himself, Yuri Fedorenko. He says that the enemy has a major objective, supposedly to capture Kupiansk by Independence Day. This has not been accomplished. It's an unrealistic objective. All those circumstances, all those dangers that exist here in the Kupiansk area, they basically understand them. I assert that all these areas where the enemy is present, Radkivka, Holubivka, Mirne, are not exactly, let's say, red zones, but rather more like gray zones, which of course pose a threat and certainly do not help, do not improve, so to speak, our logistics. However, at the same time, the enemy is not carrying out those critical buildups here that would allow them to continue attacks further, for example, directly on the Kupiansk area. Therefore, undoubtedly by August 24th, by Ukraine's Independence Day, none of this will succeed for them, Fedorenko asserts. But well, quite a lot of attention is being paid to Kupiansk. As of today, according to our military, there are not enough resources to occupy, for example, Kupiansk or to block its logistical routes. However, everything will depend on how the situation develops further, particularly in the Pokrovsk and Donetsk directions. After all frontline directions are interconnected. Right now, there isn't a single section of the front where the enemy isn't actively pressing. Siversk, Lyman, Kupiansk, Borova. By the way, in Borova as well, there have also been certain advances by the enemy recorded recently. Also, the Novopavlivka direction, the borders of Donetsk region with Dnipropetrovsk and Zaporizhzhia, Huliaipole and Orikhiv are being added to this list of enemy activities very, very soon. In fact, we are already seeing the first signs of initial offensive actions of the third major wave of the enemy's offensive in the Zaporizhzhia region. Well, that's the situation we have right now. I'll end on that note. Thank you, friends, for your attention. Take care of yourselves. All the best and see you next time.